The Galactic Council's most prestigious first contact mission was going about as well as a blind man trying to perform neurosurgery with oven mitts during an earthquake. Ambassador Hollow stood at the edge of the designated landing zone on the forest moon of Valindra, watching what could charitably be called a diplomatic incident unfold before his weathered eyes. What couldn't be called charitable was the string of profanity currently running through his mind. Words that would make a cargo hauler blush and probably violate at least 3 interstellar decency codes. The mission had started simple enough, because apparently the universe had developed quite the sense of humor over the past few millennia. Make contact with the Valindran matriarchy. Establish diplomatic relations. Don't accidentally start an interstellar war. You know, the usual Thursday afternoon activities for a middle-aged human who'd somehow convinced the council he was qualified to speak for his entire species. But then the locals had decided to crash the party. "Sir, we have a situation," Captain Flux announced, with the kind of understated delivery that suggested the situation was roughly equivalent to finding out your house was on fire while you were still inside it. The Quantum Guard commander stood rigid as a flagpole, his polished armor gleaming under the alien sun. Every inch the picture of military precision. Too bad precision wasn't going to help them out of this particular mess. The situation in question was currently chirping, squeaking, and generally making the kinds of adorable noises that would normally melt hearts across the galaxy. Unfortunately, these particular heart-melting sounds were coming from creatures that looked like someone had crossed a bear with a Teddy Factory explosion, each one roughly the size of a small hoverbike and covered in fur that shimmered between gold and silver in the dappled forest light. Cubs. Valindran cubs, to be precise. And they'd wandered right into the middle of the most important diplomatic meeting in recent galactic history. "How many?" Hollow asked, though he could count them himself. Sometimes asking obvious questions bought you precious seconds to think, and right now he needed all the thinking time he could get. 6 confirmed hostiles. "They're children, Captain." 6 confirmed biological entities, Flux corrected, with the kind of diplomatic flexibility that suggested he'd been taking lessons from a particularly stubborn asteroid. "Indigenous to this moon. Unknown threat level. Protocol suggests immediate containment." Ah, yes, protocol. The sacred texts that turned thinking beings into robots and somehow always managed to make bad situations exponentially worse. Hollow had been ignoring protocols for the better part of 20 years, which was probably why he was still alive, and why his superiors kept sending him to places where following the rules might get everyone killed. The cubs seemed blissfully unaware that they'd just become classified as biological entities with unknown threat levels. They were too busy investigating the fascinating collection of alien technology that had suddenly appeared in their backyard. One particularly brave little one was attempting to climb onto a hover cart loaded with diplomatic gifts, its tiny claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth metal surface. Another had discovered the joys of chasing its own tail in circles, while a third was engaged in what appeared to be a detailed investigation of a translator unit. "Sir, they're contaminating the equipment," one of the soldiers reported, his voice crackling through the comm system with barely concealed panic. "And they're making contact with sensitive materials." Because of course they were. Because the universe had apparently decided that today was the perfect day to test every assumption the Galactic Council had ever made about first contact procedures. "Captain, order your men to form a containment perimeter," Flux commanded, his hand moving to his sidearm with the kind of practiced ease that made Hollow's stomach drop into his boots. "Non-lethal force authorized. We cannot allow these creatures to compromise mission security." And there it was, the moment when everything would either work out fine or go spectacularly, catastrophically wrong in ways that would be studied by future diplomats as a textbook example of what not to do. 20 Quantum Guard soldiers moved with the fluid precision of a well-oiled machine, each one drawing their shock batons and activating them with a distinctive electric hum that cut through the forest air like a blade. The batons crackled with enough voltage to drop a charging war beast, their blue-white energy casting eerie shadows across the faces of highly trained soldiers who were about to use military-grade weapons on creatures that were, quite literally, playing patty cake. The cubs noticed the change immediately. Their playful chirping shifted to something higher, more urgent, something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "Easy targets," one soldier muttered, adjusting his grip on his baton. "They're not even moving fast." "Because they were babies, you magnificent military genius," Hollow thought but didn't say. Because they were curious, innocent, defenseless babies who had wandered into the wrong place at precisely the wrong moment. That's when he heard it. A sound that made every human instinct he'd ever possessed suddenly sit up and take notice. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that spoke of ancient forests, of creatures that had ruled this world since before the first spaceship had ever left its home planet. The trees began to move. Except they weren't trees. The first parent emerged from the tree line like something out of a fever dream, standing easily 3 meters tall at the shoulder, and built like someone had decided that regular bears weren't. Quite intimidating enough and needed significant upgrades. Its fur was darker than its cubs, a deep brown that seemed to absorb light, and its eyes held the kind of intelligence that made you suddenly remember that just because something looked like an animal didn't mean it was stupid. Then the second one appeared, and the third, and the fourth. "Oh," said Captain Flux, in the tone of someone who had just realized that his carefully planned military operation had overlooked one tiny, insignificant detail, like the fact that baby animals usually came equipped with parents. Large, protective, extremely unhappy parents. The adult Valindrans formed their own perimeter, a living wall of fur, muscle, and barely contained fury that surrounded the Quantum Guard soldiers who were surrounding their children. It was like watching the galaxy's most dangerous game of Ring Around the Rosie, except everyone was armed and no one was laughing. "Sir," one of the soldiers whispered into his comm, "request immediate backup. We have multiple large hostiles moving into attack positions." Hostiles. That's what they were calling them. The parents who had just watched 24 armed aliens surround their children with weapons designed to cause pain. Hollow closed his eyes and took a deep breath that tasted of alien pollen and impending disaster. In about 30 seconds, either someone was going to do something spectacularly stupid, or this was going to turn into the kind of bloodbath that would make the Council revoke humanity's membership and quite possibly declare them a galactic menace. The cubs continued to chirp, their voices growing more distressed as they sensed the tension radiating from every direction. Their parents answered with sounds that were part comfort, part warning, and entirely terrifying when coming from creatures that could probably bench press a hover tank. "Weapons hot," Captain Flux ordered, his voice carrying the weight of military training and absolutely zero diplomatic sense. "Prepare to engage on my command." Because apparently, the solution to being surrounded by angry parents was to threaten their children more creatively. Hollow opened his eyes and looked around at the tableau that would, in about 15 minutes, either be remembered as the moment humanity passed its greatest test, or the day they failed it so spectacularly that future historians would need new categories of failure to properly classify it. 20 soldiers with shock batons, 6 confused, frightened cubs. At least 8 parents who looked like they could eat tanks for breakfast and still have room for dessert. One completely insane first contact protocol that somehow hadn't accounted for the possibility that alien children might be curious. And one middle-aged human diplomat who was starting to think that his emergency rations might be more useful than anyone had ever imagined. What happened next would, in the annals of galactic history, be filed under things. That made absolutely no sense but somehow worked anyway. A category that was surprisingly thick, mostly thanks to human involvement in interstellar affairs. Ambassador Hollow reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what was quite possibly the most anticlimactic weapon in the history of armed conflict. A wrapped package of emergency rations, standard-issue human survival bread, to be exact, the kind of compressed, nutritionally optimized, taste-optional sustenance that had kept explorers alive on countless worlds and somehow managed to be both completely indestructible and entirely inoffensive to most known digestive systems. "Sir?" Captain Flux's voice carried the particular strain that came from watching your commanding officer apparently lose his mind at the worst possible moment. "Sir, what are you doing?" Hollow unwrapped the bread with the calm, methodical movements of someone who was either completely insane or operating on a level of logic so advanced it looked like insanity to everyone else. "Something that makes sense, Captain. You should try it sometime." The crackling of shock batons filled the air like some kind of electric orchestra, tuning up for a performance nobody wanted to hear. 20 highly trained soldiers stood in perfect formation, their weapons charged and ready to deliver enough voltage to stop a stampeding herd of battle rhinos. Their targets, 6 furry children, who were currently making the kind of distressed noises that would haunt the dreams of anyone with a functioning conscience. Meanwhile, their parents continued to emerge from the forest, like something out of humanity's oldest nightmares. If humanity's oldest nightmares had involved creatures that looked cuddly, right up until you noticed they had claws the size of dinner knives, and teeth that could probably open a can of soup without requiring a can opener. "Ambassador, please step back from the containment area," Flux ordered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was watching his career prospects evaporate in real time. "These creatures are unpredictable and potentially dangerous." "You're right, Captain," Hollow said, breaking off a piece of bread and holding it in his open palm. "They are unpredictable. That's what makes them interesting." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say without starting a philosophical debate that would probably get them all killed, was that the most dangerous creature in this particular tableau wasn't furry, didn't have claws, and was currently barking orders about containment protocols while completely missing the point of everything that was happening. Hollow took a step forward, moving slowly and deliberately, the way you might approach a nervous animal or a particularly volatile explosive device. The soldiers tracked him with their weapons, though whether they were planning to shoot him or the cubs remained an open question that nobody seemed eager to explore. "Easy," he said, and it wasn't clear whether he was talking to the cubs, their parents, or the 24 beings with weapons who were all staring at him like he'd just announced his intention to juggle live grenades. "Easy, everyone. We're all friends here." The cubs watched him approach with the kind of intense focus that children everywhere reserved for things that might be either wonderful or terrible. Their chirping had quieted to soft, questioning sounds that somehow managed to be both heartbreaking and hopeful at the same time. The first cub, the brave little explorer who'd been trying to climb the hover cart, tilted its head and took a cautious step forward. Its nose twitched as it caught the scent of the bread, and its eyes widened with what could charitably be called interest. and more accurately, be called desperate hunger. "That's it," Hollow murmured, crouching down until he was at eye level with creatures that were suddenly much larger and more impressive than they'd appeared from a standing position. "Just curious, aren't you? Just want to see what the strange visitors brought to your neighborhood." He held out the piece of bread, keeping his hand steady and open, the universal gesture of offering that somehow translated across species boundaries. The cub approached with the careful, deliberate steps of someone conducting a very important scientific experiment. Behind him, Hollow could hear Captain Flux having what sounded like a mild nervous breakdown, conducted entirely through gritted teeth. "Ambassador, please. This is not protocol. This is not safe. This is not stupid," Hollow interrupted, never taking his eyes off the approaching cub. "Which makes it practically revolutionary in the current context." The cub sniffed the bread with the thorough attention of a professional food critic, its wet nose almost touching Hollow's fingers. For a moment that stretched like taffy, nobody breathed. 20 soldiers, 6 cubs, 8 parents, and 1 diplomat, all frozen in a tableau that would have made a fascinating sculpture if anyone had been in the mood for art appreciation. Then the cub made a sound. It was a small sound, barely audible over the electric hum of the shock batons and the rustling of the forest around them. But it was also completely unmistakable. The sound of surprise, delight, and approval all rolled into one tiny, perfect chirp. The cub took the bread. Not grabbed, not snatched, not devoured with the desperate hunger of a wild animal. It took the bread with the careful, polite attention of a child accepting a gift from a stranger, examined it with the curiosity of a scientist, and then, with the kind of trust that made something in Hollow's chest feel suspiciously tight, bit into it. The expression that crossed the cub's face was worth every regulation he was currently violating. Pure, undiluted joy mixed with the kind of surprise that came from discovering that the universe was occasionally capable of pleasant surprises. It made a sound that was part purr, part giggle, and entirely contagious. "Well, I'll be damned," one of the soldiers muttered, and immediately caught himself. "I mean, sir, the biological entity appears to be consuming the offered substance." "It's eating bread, Henderson," Hollow said without looking up. "You can say it's eating bread." The other cubs had noticed their siblings' success and were beginning to approach with the kind of cautious optimism that suggested they'd learned that good things could happen if you were brave enough to investigate strange new experiences. Hollow broke off more pieces of bread, making sure he had enough for everyone, a skill he'd learned during 20 years of diplomatic dinners where running out of refreshments could start international incidents. One by one, the cubs approached. One by one, they accepted the offered bread. And one by one, they settled into sitting positions around the human ambassador, making the kinds of contented sounds that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to something fundamental about the joy of sharing food with friends. The shock batons continued to hum, but somehow they seemed less important now. The soldiers continued to maintain their containment perimeter, but their postures had shifted from preparing to engage hostile targets to trying to figure out what the hell is happening here. The parent Valindrans had stopped their menacing advance and were watching the proceedings with expressions that somehow managed to combine bewilderment, relief, and what might have been approval. Their children were safe, fed, and happy. Everything else was apparently secondary. "Sir," Captain Flux said, and his voice had dropped to the kind of whisper usually reserved for churches, libraries, and moments when you realize you're witnessing something that might actually be important. What do we do now?" Hollow looked around at the scene that had somehow evolved from a potential military engagement into what looked suspiciously like an impromptu picnic. 6 alien cubs sat in a rough circle around him, munching contentedly on human emergency rations, while their parents watched with the careful attention of any guardians making sure their children weren't getting into trouble. 20 Quantum Guard soldiers stood in perfect formation, their weapons ready, their training complete, and their purpose suddenly unclear, now that their targets had transformed from biological entities with unknown threat levels to children having snack time. "Now, Captain," Hollow said, pulling out another package of emergency rations and beginning to break it into child-sized portions. "We wait for their parents to decide whether we're friends or food, and we hope that sharing lunch counts as a diplomatic overture in Valindran culture." He paused, watching as the smallest cub, barely larger than a house cat, but infinitely more charming, attempted to share a piece of bread with one of the soldiers by holding it up toward the man's armored faceplate. "Because if it doesn't," Hollow added, with the kind of conversational tone that suggested he was discussing the weather rather than the potential for interspecies warfare, "we're probably about to become the main course at a very exclusive dinner party." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether bread would prove mightier than shock batons, whether curiosity would triumph over protocol, and whether a middle-aged human diplomat had just solved the galaxy's most complex first contact scenario with emergency rations and a complete disregard for common sense. The cubs continued to eat, their happy sounds filling the air like music, while their parents continued to watch with eyes that held depths of intelligence no military manual had prepared anyone to navigate. And somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, other sounds were beginning to stir, sounds that suggested this particular diplomatic encounter was far from over. The sounds emerging from the deeper forest weren't the random rustlings of wildlife going about their daily business. They were purposeful, rhythmic, and carried the unmistakable cadence of intelligence organizing itself for a specific purpose, which, in Hollow's experience, was either very good news or the kind of very bad news that required running very fast in the opposite direction. The cubs noticed first, their ears perking up like furry radar dishes as they paused in their enthusiastic consumption of human emergency rations. They made soft questioning sounds toward the forest, and their parents responded with rumbling vocalizations that managed to convey both reassurance and warning, the universal parental message of, "It's fine, but stay close anyway." Then she emerged from the tree line, and suddenly everyone's previous assumptions about this diplomatic mission underwent the kind of radical revision usually reserved for scientific theories after someone invents a better telescope. She was magnificent in the way that natural disasters were magnificent, awe-inspiring, humbling, and carrying the subtle suggestion that perhaps you should have brought better insurance. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, she moved with the fluid grace of something that had never doubted its place at the top of the food chain. Her fur was silver white with age, marked by intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as she walked, and her eyes held the kind of ancient wisdom that made even the most arrogant beings suddenly remember their manners. Behind her came others, not the scattered parents who had been watching from the trees, but an organized group moving in formation. Some carried what appeared to be ceremonial staffs carved from living wood. Others wore intricate harnesses decorated with metals that caught the filtered sunlight and threw it back in complex patterns. This wasn't a collection of concerned parents responding to a crisis. This was a delegation. "Well," Captain Flux said, in the tone of someone watching his entire worldview undergo emergency reconstruction, "this complicates things." The magnificent being at the head of the delegation approached the clearing with the measured pace of someone who owned everything she could see and was graciously allowing others to exist in her presence. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority and the musicality of someone who understood that words were tools to be wielded with precision. Of course, since nobody in the human delegation spoke Valindran, it sounded like an elaborate series of rumbles, chirps, and harmonics that could have been anything from a formal greeting to detailed instructions on how they preferred their trespassers prepared for dinner. Translation matrix activating, the diplomatic AI announced with the cheerful efficiency that somehow made even the most dire situations sound like customer service announcements. Linguistic patterns analyzing, cultural context loading, colloquial expressions cataloging. The AI paused, which in Hollow's experience usually meant it was about to deliver news that would make everyone wish they'd chosen different careers. Translation matrix. Confused. The AI continued. Subject appears to be speaking in formal diplomatic register, while simultaneously employing what can only be described as maternal scolding patterns. Recommend human diplomatic personnel prepare for conceptual paradigm adjustment. In other words, they were about to learn something that would make everything they thought they knew look embarrassingly wrong. The silver-furred matriarch completed her approach and stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene with the kind of comprehensive visual sweep that suggested she was cataloging every detail for later review. Her gaze lingered on the cubs, still sitting peacefully around Hollow, then moved to the circle of soldiers with their shock batons, then finally settled on the human ambassador himself. When she spoke again, the translation came through crystal clear, and it carried the particular tone that every parent in the galaxy would recognize immediately. You surrounded my grandchildren with weapons. Not a question, not an accusation seeking clarification. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that preceded either forgiveness or extremely creative revenge. Captain Flux stepped forward with the rigid posture of someone whose training had covered hostile negotiations, but apparently skipped the section on explaining your actions to angry grandmothers who could probably arm wrestle a hover tank. Matriarch, we were following standard containment protocols for unknown biological. You surrounded my grandchildren with weapons, she repeated, and somehow managed to make the exact same words carry twice the weight and 3 times the implied consequences. The cubs, apparently recognizing their grandmother's voice, abandoned their bread feast and bounded toward her with the enthusiasm of children everywhere who had just spotted their favorite relative. They chirped and squeaked as they rubbed against her legs, clearly recounting their adventure with the kind of excited babbling that transcended species barriers. She listened to their reports with the patient attention of someone who had raised several generations and understood that the important details were usually buried somewhere between "and then" and "it was amazing." Her expression softened as they described their encounter with the strange visitors, but when her eyes returned to the assembled humans, the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. They tell me, she said, that you offered them food when they were frightened, that you sat with them when they were alone, that you showed them kindness when your companions showed them weapons. Hollow carefully got to his feet, brushing crumbs from his diplomatic uniform and trying to look like the kind of person who regularly made first contact with alien civilizations rather than someone who was making it up as he went along. Your grandchildren were curious about our equipment, he said, choosing his words with the care of someone diffusing an explosive device. My people thought they might be dangerous. I thought they might be hungry. Hungry, she repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered in her ancient eyes. Yes, they are always hungry. Growing cubs eat everything that doesn't eat them first. She paused, studying him with the intensity of someone conducting a very important evaluation. You are the first visitors to our world who chose to feed our children rather than frighten them. This is interesting. Captain Flux cleared his throat with the careful precision of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had already escaped orbit and was heading for deep space. Matriarch, we came here to establish diplomatic relations between our peoples and the Galactic Council. We had hoped to meet with your leadership to discuss. You are meeting with our leadership, she interrupted, and the amusement in her voice was definitely growing stronger. I am Valana, First Mother of the Valindran Confluence. These are my advisors, my guards, and my patience, which is currently stretched thinner than morning mist. The advisors and guards she referred to were the beings who had accompanied her from the forest. And now that everyone knew what they were looking for, it became clear that this wasn't a rescue party or a hunting group. This was a formal delegation, complete with ceremonial regalia and the kind of organized hierarchy that suggested the Valindrans had been expecting this meeting all along. You knew we were coming, Hollow said, and it wasn't a question because suddenly all the pieces were falling into place, with the satisfying click of a puzzle being solved by someone who had been looking at it upside down. We have been waiting for you, Valana confirmed. We have been waiting for someone like you for quite some time. Though I must admit, we expected visitors who would arrive with different intentions. She gestured toward the still-armed soldiers, toward their shock batons that continued to crackle with lethal energy, toward the containment perimeter that surrounded children who were now climbing on their grandmother and demanding attention. We have received many visitors over the generations, she continued. They all spoke of peace, of cooperation, of mutual benefit. They all carried weapons that could level mountains. They all treated our children as obstacles to be managed, rather than lives to be cherished. The implications of what she was saying began to settle over the clearing like fog rolling in from the sea. This wasn't first contact. This was a test. This had always been a test. Every species that has come here has failed, Valana said, and her voice carried the weight of accumulated disappointment. Some failed quickly, with immediate violence. Others failed slowly, with gradual betrayal. All of them failed when faced with the simple choice between compassion and control. She looked directly at Hollow, and he suddenly understood that whatever happened next would determine not just the success of this diplomatic mission, but potentially the fate of humanity's relationship with something much larger and more important than anyone had realized. You chose to share your food with frightened children, she said. This suggests your species might be different. But suggestions are not certainties, and we have learned to be cautious. The cubs had settled around their grandmother's feet, still clutching pieces of bread, and watching the adults conduct their mysterious grown-up business with the kind of patient attention that suggested they understood more than they were letting on. What kind of test? Hollow asked, because sometimes the best diplomatic strategy was simply asking the question everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. Valana's smile was sharp as winter sunlight and twice as dangerous. The kind that determines whether your species is ready to learn what we really guard here, she said. And the kind that, if you fail, ensures you never get the chance to try again. The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, listening, waiting to see whether humanity's first real test would end in triumph, or in the kind of failure that didn't leave room for second chances. What Matriarch Valana said next would have made diplomatic historians weep with joy if they'd been there to hear it, and probably made military historians weep for entirely different reasons. "We are the keepers of the Harmony Protocols," she announced, and the words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Galactic Council thought it knew about power, politics, and the proper order of the universe. The name hit hollow like a physical blow. Every diplomat worth their credentials had heard whispers of the Harmony Protocols, ancient technologies that supposedly predated most known civilizations, artifacts of such significance that entire wars had been fought over rumors of their location. They were the holy grail of interstellar politics, the ultimate prize that could either unite the galaxy in unprecedented peace or tear it apart in ways that would make previous conflicts look like minor disagreements about dinner plans. And apparently, they'd been guarded by beings who tested potential recipients by seeing how they treated children. "The Harmony Protocols are real," Captain Flux breathed, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences or really impressive explosions. "Very real," Valana confirmed, "and very dangerous in the wrong hands. We have spent millennia ensuring they remain in the right ones." She gestured toward the cubs, who were still happily munching on bread and occasionally chirping commentary on the adult conversation that nobody could understand, but everyone could appreciate for its enthusiasm. "Every species that has sought the protocols has approached us with the same pattern. Grand speeches about unity, impressive displays of military might, and detailed proposals for how they would use such power responsibly. They spoke of peace while carrying weapons of war. They promised cooperation while demonstrating conquest. The pieces were falling into place with the satisfying inevitability of gravity pulling objects toward their proper destinations. This entire diplomatic mission had been orchestrated, planned, designed to reveal humanity's true nature when faced with something they couldn't control or conquer. "But you," Valana continued, focusing her ancient gaze on Hollow, "you chose bread over bullets. You chose to feed rather than frighten. You chose compassion over control when faced with the unknown." One of the cubs, the brave little explorer who had first accepted Hollow's offering, scrambled up onto its grandmother's back and settled there like a furry crown, apparently deciding that the best view of the proceedings was from the highest available perch. "This is not to say your species has passed our test," Valana added, and the temperature seemed to drop again, as everyone remembered that cosmic significance often came with cosmic consequences. One individual's kindness does not guarantee a species' wisdom. We have seen too many civilizations where good intentions at the personal level translated to catastrophic results at the societal level. Captain Flux stepped forward, his military bearing somehow managing to look both impressive and completely inadequate for the current situation. "Matriarch, what would it take for humanity to prove worthy of your trust? What must we do to demonstrate that we can handle such responsibility?" Valana's laugh was like silver bells being rung by a tornado, beautiful, musical, and carrying undertones that suggested the universe was about to become a much more interesting place. "Captain, you still don't understand. The test isn't what you can do. The test is what you choose not to do." She gestured toward the soldiers still standing in their containment formation, shock batons still humming with lethal energy, weapons still trained on cubs who were now engaged in what appeared to be an impromptu game of hide-and-seek around their grandmother's legs. "Your companion chose to offer food to frighten children, but your soldiers still surround them with weapons. Your captain still speaks of containment protocols. Your mission still approaches us as if we were a problem to be solved rather than people to be known." The words hit home with the precision of a master archer, and suddenly Hollow could see the test from the Valindran's perspective. It wasn't enough for one human to show compassion. The species as a whole had to choose cooperation over domination, understanding over control. "Stand down," Hollow said quietly. Captain Flux turned toward him with the expression of someone who had just heard their commanding officer suggest they juggle live plasma grenades. "Sir?" "Stand down, Captain. Lower your weapons. Dismiss the containment perimeter. These aren't hostile entities. They're our hosts, and we've been pointing weapons at their children for the past hour." "Sir, protocol dictates..." "Protocol dictates that we establish peaceful relations with potential allies," Hollow interrupted. "Hard to do that while threatening their grandchildren." For a moment that stretched like taffy in a solar wind, nobody moved. 20 soldiers stood with weapons drawn, waiting for orders that would either validate their training or invalidate everything they'd been taught about first contact procedures. Their captain stood between diplomatic necessity and military doctrine, trying to calculate which choice would result in fewer court-martial proceedings. Then Captain Flux made a decision that would probably be studied in military academies for the next century. "Stand down," he ordered. "Weapons down." Formation dismissed. The change was immediate and dramatic. 20 shock batons powered down with synchronized electronic sighs. 20 soldiers stepped back, lowered their weapons, and tried to look like people who had definitely not just been threatening alien children with military hardware. The cubs noticed immediately, chirping with what sounded suspiciously like approval and abandoning their hide-and-seek game to investigate these strange visitors who had suddenly become much less intimidating and much more interesting. Valana watched the transformation with eyes that missed nothing and judged everything. "Better," she said, "much better, but still not complete." She moved toward Hollow with the measured pace of someone conducting a very important evaluation, her massive frame somehow managing to seem both powerful and gentle as she navigated around cubs, who were now attempting to climb on the newly non-threatening soldiers. "The final test," she said, "is not what you do with power, but what you do without it." From somewhere within her ceremonial harness, she produced an object that made everyone's breath catch in their throats. It was small, crystalline, and seemed to contain entire galaxies' worth of swirling energy. Even without touching it, Hollow could feel the weight of its significance, the sheer potential contained within its faceted structure. "This is a harmony core," Valena explained, "one of 12 that together form the complete protocols. It contains technologies that could revolutionize faster-than-light travel, eliminate scarcity economics, enable perfect translation between any two sentient species, and provide sustainable energy for entire star systems." She held it toward Hollow, and he realized with the kind of clarity usually reserved for moments of impending doom that this was the real test. Not whether he could show kindness to children, but whether he could accept ultimate power responsibly. "It is yours," she said, "if you want it." The core pulsed with soft light, seeming to respond to his proximity. Around the clearing, soldiers and advisors alike held their breath, waiting to see whether humanity's representative would reach for the galaxy's greatest prize. Hollow looked at the core, then at Valana, then at the cubs who were still playing around the feet of beings who held weapons but were choosing not to use them. "What's the catch?" he asked. Valana's smile could have powered a small star. "The catch, Ambassador, is that accepting it means accepting responsibility, not just for your own species, but for every species that might be affected by how you choose to use such power. The catch is that the moment you take it, you become accountable for every decision your civilization makes with technologies that could reshape the galaxy." She paused, watching his face with the intensity of someone reading a book written in a language they were still learning. The catch is that the greatest test of worthiness is often the wisdom to know when you're not ready. Hollow stared at the core for a long moment, feeling the weight of humanity's future pressing down on his shoulders like a planet made of pure responsibility. Then he did something that would be remembered in diplomatic circles for the next 1,000 years. He pulled out another package of emergency rations and offered it to Valana. "I think," he said, "we should probably have lunch first and talk about this properly. Big decisions are always better on a full stomach, and I suspect this conversation is going to take a while." Valana accepted the bread with the solemnity of someone receiving a state gift, broke off a piece, and tasted it with the careful attention of a professional diplomat, evaluating the terms of a treaty. "Acceptable flavor profile," she pronounced. "Adequate nutritional content. Entirely. Suitable for extended negotiations." She tucked the harmony core back into her harness and settled onto the ground with the fluid grace of someone who had just decided that the universe could wait a little longer for its next major transformation. "Very well, Ambassador. We will have lunch and we will talk. But I warn you, by the time we finish, either your species will have earned a place among the galaxy's most trusted civilizations, or you will have learned why some prizes are too dangerous for anyone to claim." Around them, cubs began gathering again, drawn by the promise of more bread and the comfortable certainty that the adults had finally stopped pointing dangerous things at each other. Soldiers found themselves offering rations to curious alien children, while diplomatic advisors attempted to communicate through gestures and shared meals. And in the center of it all, a middle-aged human diplomat, who had somehow passed the galaxy's most important test by choosing to feed children instead of frighten them, sat down to negotiate humanity's future over emergency rations, and the kind of conversation that would determine whether the next chapter of galactic history would be written in harmony or written in blood. The cubs continued to chirp happily, their voices mixing with the sound of beings from different worlds, learning to trust each other one bite of bread at a time. As it turned out, sometimes the most profound diplomatic breakthroughs came not from grand gestures or impressive displays of power, but from the simple recognition that everyone, regardless of species, got cranky when they were hungry and happy when someone offered to share their lunch. The harmony protocols could wait another hour or two. After all, they'd been waiting for millennia. What was a little longer in exchange for the chance to do things right? And somewhere in the distance, the forest of Valindra whispered its approval, while the galaxy held its breath and waited to see whether wisdom would triumph over ambition, whether compassion would prove stronger than conquest, and whether the future would be shaped by those who knew when to reach for power and when to reach for bread instead. 3 hours later, as alien sunset painted the sky in colors that human eyes had never seen before, the impromptu diplomatic picnic had evolved into something resembling a cultural exchange program run by enthusiastic amateurs. Cubs had appointed themselves as unofficial ambassadors, teaching soldiers how to play what appeared to be an interspecies version of tag that involved a lot of cheerful squeaking and very little actual tagging. Captain Flux found himself attempting to explain human military structure to a Valindran advisor who kept interrupting with questions about why humans needed so many different types of weapons if they were supposedly peaceful. Meanwhile, Hollow discovered that Valana had a wickedly sharp sense of humor and an encyclopedic knowledge of galactic politics that made his diplomatic training look like finger painting. "Your species," she observed, watching one of his soldiers carefully share his rations with 3 cubs who had apparently decided he was their new favorite climbing structure, "has an unusual approach to problem-solving." "We're improvisational," Hollow agreed, then paused as he realized what he was about to admit. Actually, most of the time we're just making it up as we go along and hoping it works out. Valana's laughter echoed through the clearing like music, and for the first time since landing on this moon, Hollow began to think that maybe, just maybe, humanity might actually deserve a place among the stars. The universe, as it turned out, had quite the sense of humor. Who would have thought that the key to cosmic harmony would turn out to be emergency rations, and the simple understanding that sometimes the most important diplomatic tool wasn't a weapon or a treaty, but the willingness to sit down and share a meal with strangers who might become friends? But then again, that was humans for you, always finding ways to solve the galaxy's most complex problems with the most ridiculously simple solutions. And it usually worked.